Jonathan.
Yeah.
Where's the proof that Israel has killed 13,000 terrorists? Hamas claims that about 35,000 people have died in Gaza. They claim as a result of the Israeli operation. Israel says 13,000 of those are terrorists. How do you know? And where's the proof of that?
So two separate questions here. The first one is, where is the proof that we killed 13,000 terrorists? And the second one is, Hamas has claimed 33,000 individuals. Now, first and foremost, you can have the proof because every time someone's killed, there's a registration. There's what's called vidua hariga, and that number is tallied. And you know that they're terrorists because they're shooting at you, which is a bigger problem because sometimes they will not wear a particular uniform, insignia, symbolism, and you cannot tell whether they're a civilian or whether they're a terrorist. But the second somebody picks up a gun and shoots at you, we consider them a terrorist. The 33,000 number is bullshit. Hamas itself called back the number to 22,000. And they don't differentiate between combatants and terrorists. They consider everyone civilians. Now, two separate things. If a 15-year-old boy picks up a gun that's been trained in tactical warfare for 5 years since the younger age, and has been brainwashed since the age of 5 or 6, and he shoots at you, is he a civilian or a terrorist? Now, according to international law, that individual is a terrorist. How is that individual is a child, is a civilian? However, even in Western law, if a child commits murder, he's tried as an adult. So there's a jump between what we consider actionable as an adult and what the international community believes is an adult. So first and foremost, 33,000 is not the correct number. It's 22,000, and it's 13,000 combatants because they've been counted and tallied. And that number, by the way, is 13,000 combatants to roughly 9,000 civilians. It's better than any war in the past 500 years.
Here's the other problem I see with that, is that, number one, whatever the number is put forward by Hamas, it includes natural deaths in Gaza, people who die of cancer or heart attack. It does not differentiate between people who were, killed by Israeli fire and maybe also killed by missiles that were fired by Hamas or other groups and fell inside Gaza, like with that hospital, where it was initially reported incorrectly that 500 people were killed by an Israeli strike. And again, as you said, it doesn't differentiate between combatants and civilians. Obviously, it's extremely difficult to differentiate because, as everyone knows, Hamas embeds themselves into the civilian population, and it helps their political cause for civilians to die because they know that's going to get amplified by people in the West, particularly on the left of the political spectrum.
It also counts individuals that Hamas has killed themselves. You have to understand, Hamas is a terrorist organization that is actually a detriment to the Palestinian people. And if Palestinian people had a freedom of press, you'd be hearing it a lot more on their end as well. Here and there, you get some videos where they're able to portray and express their sentiment.
What do you say as it relates to the very commonplace accusation that Israel is committing genocide and that the ICJ said so?
So first and foremost, the ICJ never said that Israel is committing genocide. They never said even that Israel has plausibility of committing genocide. That's been taken completely out of context. They were discussing whether South Africa had the right to bring up a case for Palestine with regards to whether there was genocide. And they didn't find, after they reviewed the facts, obviously they didn't find any indication of genocide. More than that, though, we have to discuss what your definition of genocide is. If you had some understanding of 3 polar bears, and they were the individual polar bears of that species, and car crash killed all 3 of the polar bears in the same car crash, that driver would be committing genocide. So it has nothing to do with the number of people that are killed. It has to do with the intent of actually wanting to destroy a whole people. And when Hamas came into Israel and killed 1,200 civilians indiscriminately, with their charter and intent of killing all Jews ever to exist in Israel, the charter explicitly saying that they want all Jews to congregate in Israel so that it would be easier to exterminate them, that's genocide. If we wanted to commit genocide, we have 200,000 75-ton bombers that can flatten Gaza within a day and a half. If we wanted to commit genocide against, let's say, the Palestinian people or Muslims, there wouldn't be Muslims that make up 20% of our parliamentary system. There wouldn't be Muslims that are in positions of power, like in the Supreme Court or in the president's office or doctors.
I think they're probably differentiating. I mean, that's a very valid answer. I suppose the question really applies to Palestinian Arabs living in Gaza and the West Bank. I do think that there's a lack of awareness in the world that there are actually Arabs living in Israel. Obviously, there's no Jews living in, Morocco to Iran virtually.
Well, there's some left in Morocco, Turkey, and Iran, but there's no Jews in Libya, no Jews in Jordan, no Jews in Syria, no Jews in Lebanon, no Jews in Egypt, no Jews.
But these are very small communities. There's like 3 Jews in Egypt, right? I mean,
right. So
I think there's 25,000 Jews in Iran, actually.
Yeah, it's actually the 3 Muslim areas where Jews still remain are in Iran, Turkey, and Morocco. But the push for Jews out of the entirety of the Middle East, North Africa, came about in a genocidal context. If we wanted to do the same to the Palestinians, we wouldn't have given them 75% of the mandate of Palestine in 1947. We wouldn't have declared a peace agreement 14 different times. We wouldn't have disengaged from Gaza in 2005.
Remember, in 1967, Moshe Dayan said, and again, as civilians, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more going on. We're not perhaps privy to. Nevertheless, Moshe Dayan, when Israel first got these territories, back then it was Sinai, Gaza, West Bank, Golan Heights, he said he's waiting for the phone to ring to talk peace with the Arabs. Instead, they had a conference in Sudan, and the Arab countries agreed no recognition of Israel, no peace with Israel, no negotiation with Israel. After that, then Israel started to develop the territory. Obviously, Begin returned Sinai to Egypt in exchange for peace.
But also, you say when Israel got the territories in 67, there were Jews living in the territories prior to 67.
There were, of course.
And continuously for the past 3,000 years. And during the mandate of Palestine, we were supposed to have a Jewish homeland there to begin with as well. Now, does that mean that there's no Arabs living amongst us? Of course not. The only people that want a homogenous state are the Arabs that refuse for Jews to live within their countries, refuse for them to own land, to vote, to be citizens in those countries. We, on the contrary, are very much Republican. You walk on the streets here in Tel Aviv, you're going to have a person that will create race, ethnicity, and background. I think that's the double standard that most people don't internalize.
What do you say to people most people who ask this question are going to have likely a rudimentary knowledge of the conflict, but what do you say to people who say Israel should just leave the Palestinian territories, the disputed territories, give Palestinians the land that they want, and that would solve the issue?
So let's define your last point, the land that they want. Most Palestinians want the entirety of Israel, from the river to the sea, not just Palestinians, those that are pro.
They're not hiding it.
And they're not hiding it. They're very frank about it. Now, when you're talking about why do you give the West Bank and Gaza, it's a different story. The West Bank and Gaza was not Israel by Western terms.
It was Egypt and Jordan.
Egypt and Jordan. It's called the West Bank of
Obviously, prior to that, it was the British mandate. Prior to that,
right. The Ottomans, they called it Southern Syria during the Ottoman Empire period. What I'm trying to say is simply, when we didn't have those territories, they were still killing us. Before Israel was even, the modern state was even reestablished, they were still killing us.
Well, the PLO was founded in 1964,
right?
3 years before the 67 war, where Israel was enlarged. By the way, by Yasser Arafat, who was born in Egypt.
He was born in Egypt.
I don't deny his identity as a Palestinian. Identity is a complicated thing, but it's worth noting he was born in Egypt.
Right.
I think one of his parents was a Palestinian. The other was Egyptian.
So today I don't deny Palestinian nationhood at all, since the Oslo Accords. I do call into question the legitimacy of the nationhood prior to 96. Why? Because prior to 96, the entire mandate was called Palestine. It had nothing to do with whether you were Muslim.
96?
Of course. The mandate of Palestine was from the end of World War I and all the way through to 1948.
So prior to 48, maybe.
It was called the Mandate of Palestine, but it was called the Mandate of Palestine Aleph Yud, which stands for Eretz Israel. So it wasn't unified. The concept of Palestine, I'm referring to as 96, is a Palestine that's free of Jews. And that's a new nationhood that came about post the Oslo Post. I think it was 95, actually.
Okay.
So to answer your question, which was, what would you say to those who say give land for peace? A, we tried that, there was no peace.
Yeah.
B, when we didn't have the land, there was no peace.
Yeah.
And C, when we weren't there was no peace. And clearly, that's not a solution.
I think here's the issue. There is a futility to occupation, to ruling over other people or controlling other people, but the catch-22 is there's also a futility to negotiation. Because I think that it's so fundamental to the Palestinian identity, opposition to the Jews being here. That's why they don't want to recognize Israel as a Jewish state, because that would contravene their very identity.
It's just
as a nation.
Exactly. Just like our identity comes from coming back to Israel, our identity comes from Jews in the diaspora.
It's a sort of negative right.
Exactly.
As opposed to a positive right.
Just as our holidays revolve around like Jewish connection to the land and returning to our homeland, their identity comes from the negation of Jews living in that area. Because look at their flag. Their flag was started during the Arab Revolt. It was an inversion of the Arab Revolt flag that started in southern Saudi Arabia during a pan-Arabist movement in World War II. It wasn't considered an independent country. There was no prime minister, there was no currency, there was no flag, there was no national anthem. These are all concepts that came about post facto. So in my mind, now that they are self-identifying as a people and they're living amongst us and they want their own nationhood, I'm not one to stop that. I just want to make sure that doesn't come at the cost of my nationhood and that their identity isn't directly involved with the death of my identity, at the cost of my identity.
I think that the fundamental reason that there's been no peace agreement is what I said, is that they would be compromising on their nationhood to recognize Israel.
It's also against their religion. A lot of the extremists amongst them believe that Israel's a Waqf territory, and they're not allowed to, morally speaking, give any Waqf territory to what they consider a kofir, or kfir, or infidel in English. So just like they consider Medina and Mecca as Waqf, meaning inherited from Allah to them, so do they consider Al-Aqsa and Al-Hamda. So I don't believe that the extremists amongst them will ever agree to a peace agreement, because it's literally against their religion to do so. Those moderates that are more secular, we need to empower so that they're the ones that make the calls in that area.
Probably the Palestinians themselves want to empower them, for them to have any credibility.
Yeah, if we did it, it'd look like, just like when I say anything to anybody, that's false because of who you are, or what you serve, or what your nationality is.
Yeah.
So too, they have to do it themselves. I don't see any, long-term solution. I see some band-aids that we can do in the meantime. Yeah. Sorry to be pessimistic, bro.
Ended on a pessimistic note, why not?